Hello and welcome to the latest Roundtable video. I'm super excited about this. We have some very important people, much more important than I am, in this video today, and I'm excited to talk to them. Joining us today, we have Theo Zunich, the president and CEO of YSS, a high-end cannabis retailer based in Calgary. Theo, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us today is Matei Olaru, the CEO of Lift & Co., who kind of have their hands in all aspects of the cannabis business, but are most known for the expos every year. Matei, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And last but not least is Afzal Hasan, the former president and general counsel of Origin House, who is also a distinguished corporate lawyer and has gone through countless acquisitions. Afzal, welcome.
Thanks, Alex.
I hope everyone's doing well today.
For sure.
Absolutely.
So we recently conducted a survey, and we were looking for like a deeper insight to the data we collected. And, we wanted opinions from different aspects of the industry. So we're really excited to dive into this data. So let's get right into it. Our data suggests that 54% of those surveyed are consuming more cannabis during quarantine, as compared to only about 5% are consuming less. How do you think this effect will impact cannabis company performance in the short and long term? Let's start with Theo and move around to Matei and then Afzal.
Sure. I think in the short term, it's going to be a little bit of a shot in the arm for the growth of the sector. As a retailer, we believe in the long term, the multi-year growth of the sector. And I mean, we've seen it in the stores. Definitely saw March peak in terms of sales. April was pretty steady despite many of the COVID concerns. And then May just kept on rolling. Growth we had expected because, we look at the market stats in, we're solely Alberta and Saskatchewan right now. And we look at market stats in Colorado suggesting you have multi-year growth before you start reaching that. Colorado did 1.4 billion in rec sales last year.
Right.
So we believe in the growth, and we feel like this COVID situation and seeing the consumption and the sales growth, I guess, accelerate a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the market's going to get there. This just helps move it a little quicker.
Right. Exactly. Matei?
I think in the long term, maybe a bit of a prediction. I'd be curious to understand the dynamics of consumptions in a household. So let's say you live with someone that maybe wasn't a regular consumer or had only tried it a few times. Can, your partner consuming more, compounded with boredom, compounded with less things to do, maybe influence you to become a long-term consumer because now you have a chance to try it in almost by circumstance, you're forced to try it more. So I'd be curious if you could see new long-term consumers come out of this. But in the short term, I totally agree. You're going to see some really nice sales.
Afzal?
Yeah, I think I've been hearing and seeing the same thing as well, both in Canada and the US too. A lot of companies that were set up to take advantage of actually having an increase in consumption have benefited in the sense of increased revenues. With the asterisks that it is obviously coming at a pretty challenging time. People have had to rejig how some of their operations work. At the minimum, you've had to figure out how remote working works, had to figure out how to deal with the new retail laws if you're a retailer, and even if you're just a manufacturer, basic things like putting your plants in the ground at the right time if you're outdoors, or getting your harvests all working in a timely fashion. Like, these are things that I think did present challenges to companies that were out there in the space too. So by and large, from what I've heard, many have been able to benefit in the sense of the economic side of being able to increase their sales. But there's definitely been some challenges, I think, mixed in as well. The consumer side, I think that's been interesting too, depending on wherever you're living. It's been a evolution of the supply chain from what I can see, no matter where you're living. Here in Ontario, for example, where I am, we've had to go through a few iterations, and it went from initially cannabis being deemed an essential service and our retailers being open for a period of time, then them being stricken off the list a bit of a hoopla arising as a result of them being stricken off the list of essential businesses. And then they kind of went back into delivery for a period of time, and then it's now into storefront. And so that has been challenging for consumers, I want to say. I mean, for me, I've been finding that I have to constantly pay attention to what I can buy and what I can't, where I can buy it, etc. And that's just work that it's extra and additional on top of what I want to put in as a consumer in a typical product market. So that's been interesting, and I think it has resulted in wholesale shifts for me and other people that I've seen as consumers too, because of the fact that the OCS sprung up as a quasi-monopoly for at least periods of time. You had people that were kind of forced to order through OCS for the first time, and I'd be in that same bucket. I just never went through the process of being an online order for a variety of reasons. And now, because of the fact that they've knocked off their free shipping, I'm a really regular consumer, but I now scratch my head at the amount of cardboard and junk that's piling up my place, because they'll literally deliver 3 or 4 cans of beverages or a half quarter of cannabis over to your house in a plastic box with a courier. And so a lot of head scratching for me in terms of the economics and the reality of what we're creating right now, but certainly one that's keeping the consumers on their toes. And as you're pointing out, they're consuming more too. So, and I think as Matei's hinting too, I think there are going to be some lasting shifts that come out of playing this round robin and merry-go-round right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually experienced that same thing on a personal level because I'm also in Toronto. But on that packaging note, it's like Amazon. The OCS is like Amazon. They send you a box that's like this big for something that is, this small.
Oh, yeah.
It just feels wasteful after a while.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually get into the online cannabis sellers in a different question. So I'm glad you touched on that. Let's move on to the next one. The primary preferred method of consumption of our respondents, which is vaporizers, jumped by approximately 30% from before to after COVID. Smoking in comparison took a dive of 50%. What do you think drove this behavioral change, and what opportunities do you see evolving as a result? Theo?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think there is an aspect of it that is health related. I think people are trying to move away from smoking in general. As a consumer, I'm mixed in my forms of consumption, but I do try to find healthier alternatives. I do enjoy a joint once in a while, but there's better alternatives in terms of health. I also think it ties directly to the availability of new product types. Ontario is a little bit further ahead than Alberta and Saskatchewan in terms of rolling out the oil vapes, edibles, beverages, and in Alberta at least we're getting that now. So just having those products on the shelves, having those oil vapes on the shelves, providing an option for the people that historically bought those in the black market, I think is helping drive that consumer growth. And then once people try it and they get an opportunity to try some of these legal products and enjoy them, they're coming back for more.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that it's a lot safer than buying it off the black market, right?
Yeah, we should reemphasize that again. It's a lot safer than buying on the black market. All the issues, those were black market products. We're working around that.
Matei, what are your thoughts?
Nothing new to add other than I think this would accelerate things that were already happening. So health conscious consumers, notwithstanding smoking's been in a decline. And then we had that interim phase where it turns out maybe e-juices aren't the best for you either. This is probably the cherry on top for someone that didn't consider smoking cannabis bad, but now they think, shit, I shouldn't have said that. There's so many things going against smoking that will you have long-term behavioral changes? Maybe. I'm also mixing my consumption, and I prefer smoking joints. I do think more about it, but I don't know if I'm going to change long-term, and that's a sample of one. But I do think about it more, and that is something that is new.
Look, just because we're TVape, it doesn't mean you have to tell me you guys use vaporizers. I want you to be honest. I get it. Afzal, what are your thoughts?
I kind of sit in the same camp as Matei, but I also understand why the survey data would start skewing a certain way, because I think it's natural once you start to ramp up the amount that you're consuming that you're just going to notice what that does to your body. And I won't get into any of the science, which is just all over the place about health effects, but at the end of the day, when you're smoking a joint, there's a lot of matter that's being inhaled and coated inside your lungs, and then it needs to come out. And so what that means is that you're going to be coughing up a lot of phlegm, and it like that's just your natural way of getting rid of these things. Like it just doesn't disappear and absorb into nothing. And so I think that as people start to ramp up the consumption, you just start to notice that a little bit more, right? It's one thing if you're smoking a joint every couple of days, but if you're smoking 3 or 4 or 5 of them, you're going to start noticing just the volume of stuff that's going in. And so vaporizers, for example, at least in my experience, I've noticed that the volume of inhalation is going to be less. And so at least logically, you're assuming that there's less that's going in. And then obviously once you get into edibles and other types of products, different types of impacts. So I think it's natural to occur when people just ramp up their consumption and then get a better handle of what is happening in their body or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not to mention cost of product as well, which I think for people on, people on CERB or what have you, government-funded pay plans, that might influence it as well.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of consumption during the day, which I think we touched on just a bit earlier, before COVID-related restrictions hit, 84% of respondents would start consuming cannabis in the evening. After COVID, consumption doubled in the afternoon and the morning times. What do you think drives this change, and how will it impact your sector specifically?
Yeah, I think, one thing we saw almost immediately, I think it's reflective of the fact that people were being responsible about staying home. But we saw our sales, typically at peaks and valleys every day. Mm-hmm. In terms of sales. It just became a steady incline towards the end of the day. Like it just completely changed almost immediately. Now, as in Alberta, at least a lot of the measures are being lifted, and we're starting to see those peaks and valleys, like after work, everybody swings by their store. So we definitely saw it. And I think, some of the things we've heard, it makes light of the situation a little bit. But again, it talks about the fact that people are staying home, or at least trying to. Every day is a Saturday right now for many people.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it is. Your home ties to a lot of the concepts we're talking about. You're at home. You don't have the ability to go socialize. So you're looking to substitute with another form of, enjoyment. Mm-hmm. And people are, trying new products. I think Matei made a great point. You're bringing new consumers or new consumer groups to the market. I think they would have got there anyways, but you're really accelerating the adoption of the products. But yeah, we've seen it for sure, and I think it just ties to the fact that people are trying to find something to do during the day.
Mm-hmm. And how about for you, Matei?
I think spot on. The one thing I think where this trend might be different is I would view this one as temporary, unless everyone stays unemployed and can work from home and consume, right, which seems to be what's happening right now, would be my read on some of that data. That's probably going to change. So I would expect this to, as restrictions lift, consumption should go back to more regular patterns.
You're bang on, Matei. We're already seeing it.
Yeah.
Afzal, how about for you?
I think that's, I'd agree with everything that's been said. The only thing that I'm really curious about, and I've heard little bits and pieces of this so far from kind of people that I speak to through the course of this quarantine and people staying more indoors and being restricted, is whether or not you actually do have people that pick up lasting behavioral patterns. So I have heard, for example, and this is not a regular thing, but people dabbling with mixing work and cannabis. And sometimes that can be disastrous. Like if you're operating a car or heavy machinery, it is outright illegal. And so, that's one boundary that you're not going to be able to cross. But when you start to pull back on the spectrum of the types of work that you can do, certain types of work are actually been found to be enhanced, for example, by people that have jobs that tend to be more routine or monotonous, or that might require some light level of customer service interaction, etc. I mean, I've actually spoken to people that have found the right product, not something that's going to get you completely high out of your mind or out there into space, but something that's relatively light can actually enhance your working experience. And people have had the flexibility to experiment in a way that they just haven't had before. Because the interesting thing, and this is maybe a coincidence or maybe not, is that the jobs that maybe are most conducive to people potentially functioning well or better while using cannabis have traditionally been ones that require you to sit at a desk with a lot of people around you and a lot of supervision and eyeing you regularly to effectively make sure that you're working, or whatever the impetus is. And so it's been a unique circumstance, I think, for people that have the types of jobs potentially that could allow them to consume cannabis, to actually have for the first time the opportunity to see, does this mix without having to go through something like consuming cannabis in a surreptitious manner at their workplace, which is obviously a whole bag of problems that you just wouldn't want to have to deal with otherwise. So I have been hearing a little bit about that, and curious to see if that actually does continue on into longer term, because I do believe, in, as everybody's pointing out, a lot of the increase in consumption is temporary, but you never know. People, I think, are being exposed to a lot of new concepts generally as a result of the shift in the way that they have to work. And the fact that there may be some lasting patterns, I think, is probably what makes this the most interesting for product salespeople, marketers, and developers. Is just what this opens up in terms of new possibilities into the future.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, this is an unprecedented time, right? So all of this is just guesswork. We're working on data and theory, but you never know. Like, people could pick up new habits, and people could change their change the way they consume, or change when or how they consume. Yeah. So we touched on this a little bit before, but according to our survey data, stores have, like brick and mortar stores, have lost out greatly to online cannabis sellers. Even before COVID, it was hard to compete with online monopolies like the OCS or BCLDB as a brick and mortar cannabis store. What do you think should be done to level the playing field and avoid alienation of small businesses?
I mean, we operate right now in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I suspect some of that survey data is from Ontario. And so what could be done? I mean, I think we got to look. I think Ontario and BC should look to Alberta as a bit of an example. In Alberta, the AGLC is our regulator. They do control the online platform, but it's not meant to profit. And this is evidenced through some of the actions they take. AGLC doesn't add a margin when they sell it to us. And they're very transparent about their online pricing. And they're not out there trying to sell more online. It truly is there for people that, due to, the continuation of stigma, don't want to go into a store. People that don't have access to a store. I mean, and that's very limited now in Alberta with, 450 stores now. And really displacing the black market. So providing as many access points with effective price points as possible. I think when you look at Saskatchewan and Alberta, from a regulatory perspective, they've done it better than the other provinces. There's probably a time in the future when AGLC may start adding a margin before selling to the retailers to pay for their wholesale network, which is incredibly convenient for us. But at this point, they're not. They're letting us compete with the black market in every way, and they're doing their best to stay out of the way. So I think that looking to Alberta and looking to Saskatchewan's regulatory environments is a good first step to find out how to allow the bricks and mortar in BC and Ontario compete with the black market. I mean, that's the real competitor here. It's not, the government shouldn't be competing with people that are employing everybody. And it does frustrate me. And it starts and ends with the fact that they should have more licenses in Ontario and BC by now. It doesn't make any sense anymore. The supply chain is fixed.
Yeah.
Figure it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Matei?
Ontario is a little bit different, I think. If you look at their website, it's meant to be a button-up e-com solution. They tried really hard to build a brand around going to the OCS and the OCS experience and all that jazz. And, now because of COVID, I've noticed stores doing delivery or pickup, like they can do their own delivery essentially. I think that is still enforced for another week or so. And please correct me if I'm wrong. But I saw that and I wondered, why would I order from them when I've been ordering from the OCS? Again, sample of one. And I don't know how successful these stores have been delivering. Pickup is different because I think it fills a different need. But, what can be done? Unless the government decides we don't want to make money off cannabis directly and we just want to build it into, the retail margin, I don't think anything can be done. It's profit seeking for the government. Like the LCBO is there to make a profit. And when we spoke to regulators early on, as we were building CanCell, they said, look, we are not at that stage, but the LCBO is. Right now, we're at getting rid of the black market, protecting those vulnerable groups, the stated mandate. But you have to believe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be a business like the LCBO with pretty magazines and recipes and great commercial spots wherever they're available. I don't see it going away personally.
And how about you, Afzal?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I actually wasn't aware of the details of how the systems worked out west that you had pointed out, and it's interesting to hear that because it's I think a step in the right direction, at least versus what we have in Ontario. But like the general proposition, and this is something that I'd say pretty emphatically after having seen legalization across dozens of different US states, now Canadian jurisdictions, it's just the more free market, the better. And there is absolutely no way of getting around this principle. Once you start to play nonsense with the rules, start hoarding licenses, start to run all sorts of checks and hold back your actual ecosystem and start having political cronyism in the background being alleged, and I mean, at least in several US states, as to what's actually propelled a lot of the way that these regulations and systems have developed. I mean, that's what ends up having counterproductive, perverse impacts on the end user. Conversely, when you have open markets, what you have happen is definitely a lot of competition. You're going to have tons of businesses that go out there to try and compete and fall flat on their faces and then go bankrupt. And that's just frankly how it is in every other industry too, and just the way that it should be. But the flip side of it is that you actually have the best experience for the customer from virtually every angle when you actually have all those barriers lifted. The only other thing that you could do to be more successful is have a free market and actually support the eradication of the black market. So things like actually having a provincial distributor that doesn't charge any margin. I mean, that's actually going a step in the right direction of allowing for more positive reinforcement of the types of behaviors that you want to see. Whereas, I mean, you take the Ontario experience, I mean, it's been a joke right from the beginning. We went from this crazy lottery system of handing out 25 different licenses that ended up being kind of turned on its head because you have stores that were entering into all these crazy licensing deals that nobody could understand and having the biggest logos pop up on their store despite being won by some person that had nothing to do with these companies. It then went from that into having a bunch more licenses handed out, then went to a free-for-all of we will technically hand out as many licenses as people apply, but we actually will have such a huge backlog and such a backward way of processing it that you won't see very many stores coming out. Then you have people having these things go back and forth with delivery. You then have the government literally turn on a dime and say retailers that have only been brick and mortar are now going to be eligible to do delivery, which as a business person, like this is a whole different business. It's like if you're a farmer and then asked to run a store or something, right? Like you don't do that overnight. But the unfortunate part is that if you're a retailer in Ontario, you kind of had to keep up with the Joneses, because if you're not doing it, you're going to be falling behind your competition. And so now you've had to go through all sorts of this stuff just to stay competitive and in the market. And again, it's all driven by regulators putting in regulations that weren't terribly well thought out to begin with and just weren't necessary either. Because taking a step back, if the government had literally just allowed it to be a licensing regime where you could have your own license and away you go right from day one, you would have had a very different situation that probably would have looked a lot more like Alberta's situation, where you have much higher numbers of stores in an absolute term than Ontario, despite having a fraction of the population. And per capita consumption is also higher, which signals obviously that the black market has less of a hold, because you can bet dollars to donuts people in Ontario are not smoking less cannabis per capita. It's just where they're buying it from. So anyways, it's a rant that I could go on forever because of the legal side. I've had to take a look at a lot of the regulations in a lot of different places. And the only thing that I can say, just as a principle rule, the more regulation, the worse it is. And they just tend to be so poorly thought out and so counterproductive that they just don't seem to function the way that they say that they should, which is theoretically to eradicate the black market, which is alive and strong and thriving in every single jurisdiction across Canada and the US and across the world.
Well, that's the only thing I will say. Like, obviously, I don't have as much knowledge on the subject as any of you guys, but I will say when the OCS first started, we were kind of looking to it as something that would eradicate the black market and would undercut prices and would be at least competitive with, so I could stop going and listening to a guy's full demo before I had left with the product that I wanted. But then they came in and the prices were high and everything was kind of, it seemed not as well thought out as it could be. And
want to buy something that has 5 to 15% THC.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's frustrating.
Yeah. Imagine you went to the LCBO and you bought a bottle of alcohol that said 39 to 56%. I understand it's not an exact science.
No, it's the same idea.
Right, but it's anyways, I don't really know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to stop.
I mean, to put it in perspective, like I reached out to our AGLC rep this morning. It's a two-way street with these guys. I told them I was doing this. They gave me some input. They're excited to talk about this. They're excited about the progress that's been made in Alberta, and they listen to everything we tell them.
That's awesome.
It's pretty cool.
See, that's something to achieve in Ontario for sure. I mean, those are all my prepared questions. Would any of you guys like to talk about anything else with related to COVID-19 consumption or anything like that? Because the floor is open.
Yeah, I think there were some comments about whether this is temporary or not, the increased consumption, and it's had me thinking a little bit more. I mean, we're seeing a change. I mean, we saw a change in when people purchased, but that doesn't necessarily mean consumption, right? So I've been thinking more and more about it after we discussed it earlier, and when I think about aggregate sales, it's not changing. Like, we're not seeing aggregate sales come down. So to the point that, I think we are seeing the market size grow, and maybe again, I think it was just accelerated a little bit by this COVID situation. But people are buying, and maybe they got some extra in their pantry. Maybe they are consuming more. I don't see anything in our data now that would suggest they're not. So all the gains gained through the COVID-19 situation. Like I said, I think the market's going to be, like, I'm a big believer of where this market's going to go. And I think we just are accelerating there, and I don't believe we're going to lose lost ground. So, maybe the time that people consume is going to continue to evolve as the COVID situation does. But the market growth, I mean, even before COVID hit, we were seeing it. January, February, we were seeing those trends. Alberta did 200 million last year in sales. We're already on pace to do 400 to 440 this year. So, that market's going to be $1 billion in 4 or 5 years. So we're still growing. COVID, I think it's less impactful to the market as it is to consumption habits that could change back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, I think with the timing too, you also had a fair amount of Cannabis 2.0 products finally trickle into the market right around the same time. Like beverages, for example, I had been trying my hardest to try and get my hands on any of the ready-to-drink stuff for months and months after they were purportedly released, and only got my hands on them probably in like March or April. And so that was the first time that I started to see it regularly in stock anywhere in stores as well as online. And I don't know that was a hugely awaited product category for any consumers, just because we obviously have no advertising, marketing, and everything else. So who would know that this is happening? But at least for people that were looking out for it, you might have had some sort of an increase in consumption over there, which I thought was a positive. The vaporizers, so the oil vapes, like the cartridge vapes too, I think those were out a little bit earlier in Ontario, at least. I remember seeing some inventory and supply, but without naming names as to specific companies, there was only one company that was stocking cartridges that actually had a reasonable price to quality and potency ratio. All the rest of them seemed to be in like kind of a different stratosphere altogether. And unfortunately, I think the pricing led all the consumers to that one single vape pen company, and that was just out of supply for a good period of time, at least in my experience over here in Ontario. And then it finally came back at some point during the COVID crisis. And I think also some other manufacturers started to reduce their pricing. Well, actually, one other thing on the pricing too, massive price cuts at the OCS, at least. I don't know what you've been seeing in other provinces, but over the past 2 months, you've been seeing like some of them go down to half. And that's because their inventory was junk and is never going to sell. And so maybe they're getting rid of it. But I think a lot of people are feeling the impact of the value brands like Daily Special that have really brought a new price setting into the market, which really I think has ramped up consumption. So a lot of people that I know would never touch legal cannabis are now finally touching it because it's actually at a reasonable price point versus legacy market cannabis.
We see wholesale decreases in prices every week. And it's now it's happening on 2.0, but it's been happening on dried flower since last March. It's okay. Here's the weekly price decrease. Like that's what it's turning into. And then, we just manage that with their inventory. But yeah, we're seeing it too.
Curious, when people were raising money 3-4 years ago, they would say cannabis is recession proof and it's going to do well in crises. And I think people may have underestimated how well it can do. So that's been a pleasant surprise as a market participant to see, maybe acceleration of patterns and all the growth that we're seeing. Like Aurora's earnings were, I don't know if they were a blip and they're going to replicate next quarter, but notwithstanding they maybe did some things better. I can't believe that they turned that ship around so quickly, or the stock price went through the roof. There has to be market forces behind that. Like strong market forces behind
really
that.
Special because Tweed and the very same, their parent company in the very same quarter went complete nose
the other way. You're right. Right.
And those value brands really, I think, have brought some wind into the sails for the market generally. And so one of the exciting things about actually allowing capitalism and these systems to work is that you're finally seeing that competition and the prices go in the direction the consumers want.
That's a good point.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for adding your insights on all this data. Like it's been a pleasure. I've learned a bunch, so hopefully our viewers will too. Is there anything we want to say quickly before we sign off? Like where can we find you? Do you want to?
Sure.
Yeah. I'm looking at Theo because he's got the big YSS behind,
In Alberta and Saskatchewan, soon in Waterloo. We visit our websites, YSS Corp, Sweet Tree, Cannabis, and Instagram, and whatever social media you like. Follow us. Check out our Click and Collect if you live in Alberta. Thank you, TVape. You guys rule.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. I'll add Lift Expo is on. It'll take place in November.
No way.
Sweet.
Short of someone canceling it for us, like a government body or a regulatory body. We partnered with a group from the US called MCI. They do something like 20,000 events a year. They're going to put on our expo for November at the convention center.
Oh, that's awesome. I will definitely be there.
Fantastic. Wear a mask.
Absolutely.
We got to make some YSS masks now. Right.
No sharing cases, no. Afzal?
I've got no plugs for the moment until I wait for regulators to allow me to keep moving forward with my fund. So
has to be legal.
TVape.
Yeah, one of four of us has to be regulated out of this, right?
All right, gentlemen. Well, really, it was a huge pleasure to have you in. I'm really glad we got your insight on everything. You're always welcome back anytime, and I appreciate this a whole bunch.
Cool.
It's great.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen.
guys.
Take care.
Thanks, TVape. Cheers.
Thank you very much.